I remember the smell of incense when they first brought me to the Cathedral of Perpetual Vigil, how it mixed with the acrid tang of my own fierce sweat until I couldn't tell where the sacred ended and the profane began. My hands were bound with sanctified chains that left rust-colored impressions on my wrists, and the tech priest who processed my intake never looked at my face, only at the data slate that flickered with my designation. Penitent Candidate 7,749 Theta. Grade 3 Heretical Exposure. Faith Testing Assignment Approved. I was 23 years old, though I wouldn't remain so for long, not in any way that mattered. The floor beneath my bare feet was black marble veined with gold, polished to such perfection that I could see my reflection staring back at me, hollow-eyed and gaunt from 3 months in the holding cells. They hadn't starved me, not exactly, but the nutrient paste they provided tasted of copper and despair, and I'd learned to eat it quickly before my mind could process what I was consuming. The cathedral rose around me like the ribcage of some impossibly vast beast, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow even though thousands of candles burned in iron sconces along the walls. I could hear them, the other faith testers, their voices rising in mandatory prayer from deeper within the structure, a sound like wind through broken glass, beautiful and terrible and utterly without hope. My crime had been simple enough, the kind of thing that happened to thousands of souls across the Imperium every day. I'd questioned a pronouncement from the local presbyter, a minor doctrinal matter about the proper number of genuflections required when passing a shrine to the Emperor. 7. I'd been taught as a child. 9. The presbyter had insisted, and when I'd politely suggested that my catechism instructors had perhaps taught differently, when I'd made the mistake of implying that somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of imperial faith there might exist even the smallest inconsistency, I'd sealed my fate as surely as if I'd carved the 8-pointed star into my own flesh. The Arbites had come that night, their boots echoing on the Habblock stairs like the countdown to my execution. They'd been almost kind, in their way, explaining that my options were limited: immediate execution for suspected heresy, or voluntary submission to the faith-testing program, where my doubt could be refined, purified, transformed into something useful for the Imperium. I'd chosen the latter, of course, because I was young and still believed that survival mattered, that there was some future beyond the moment in which I stood. How naive that version of myself seemed now. How distant, as if I were remembering a person who had never truly existed at all. The priest who greeted me in the chamber of initial consecration wore robes of deep crimson, so dark they appeared black in the candlelight, and his face was a mask of ritual scarification that made his expressions impossible to read. He spoke in High Gothic, the formal cadences of the ecclesiastical language making every word feel like a judgment, and I understood perhaps half of what he said. The essential points were clear enough. I was no longer a citizen of the Imperium in any meaningful sense. I was an instrument, a tool, a necessary component in the great machinery of faith that kept humanity's collective soul from drowning in the warp. My purpose, he explained with what might have been gentleness, or might have been profound indifference, was to expose myself to the spiritual poisons that threatened the faithful, to consume doubt and heresy and forbidden knowledge, so that it might be studied, catalogued, understood. I was to be a living test subject for every corrupting influence the Inquisition encountered, every questionable text, every suspected artifact, every whispered teaching that might lead loyal servants of the Emperor astray. If I survived the exposure with my faith intact, it proved the material was safe. If I failed, if the heresy took root in my mind, well, that was useful information too, and my execution would be swift, and my soul's fate left to the Emperor's judgment. They began the conditioning that very night, strapping me into a brass throne engraved with litanies of protection while servitors attached neural induction coils to my temples. The machine they called the Confessor hummed with barely contained power, its banks of cogitators processing the theological algorithms that would supposedly fortify my mind against corruption. I felt it as a pressure building behind my eyes, a sensation like drowning in warm honey, while voices recited the Imperial creed directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely, the words burrowing into my thoughts, like parasites, seeking dark places to lay their eggs. The process lasted 6 hours, though I lost all sense of time after the first 30 minutes, and when they finally unstrapped me, I vomited across the pristine floor, bile and blood, and something that glittered like powdered glass. The tech priest made a notation on his data slate, apparently satisfied, and I was dragged to my cell by servo skulls, whose empty eye sockets seemed to regard me with more compassion than any living thing in that place. My cell was 3 meters square, carved from what might have been limestone or might have been compressed bone. I could never quite tell. A thin mattress lay on the floor, and in one corner stood a small shrine to the Emperor, his face rendered in chipped ceramite, his eyes following me wherever I moved. I was expected to pray 6 times per day, and the first few weeks I complied, reciting the words I'd known since childhood, finding a strange comfort in their familiarity, even as my situation grew increasingly incomprehensible. The other faith testers I encountered during our mandatory assembly periods were a mixture of the broken and the fanatical, some reduced to gibbering husks by whatever they'd been exposed to, others burning with such fervent belief that it seemed likely to immolate them from within. We weren't supposed to speak to each other, but sometimes in the darkness between prayers I could hear voices from neighboring cells, whispering fragments of whatever heresies had been planted in their minds, and I would press my hands over my ears and recite the litany of protection until the sounds faded or until I fell asleep, whichever came first. The first test came after 2 weeks of conditioning, a seemingly endless cycle of prayer and neural induction and minimal sustenance that had left me feeling hollowed out, scoured clean of everything but the most basic adherence to doctrine. They brought me to a white room, painfully bright after the perpetual gloom of my cell, and sat me at a simple wooden table, across from a man whose face I was instructed not to look at directly. Between us lay a book, its cover plain brown synth leather, unmarked except for a small symbol I didn't recognize. The proctor, a thin woman in the robes of the Ecclesiarchy, explained that I was to read the book aloud while they monitored my reactions. If at any point I felt the touch of corruption, I was to stop immediately and signal for purification. I asked what the book contained, and she smiled, an expression that never reached her eyes. "Doubt," she said simply, and gestured for me to begin. The text was a philosophical treatise, written in what appeared to be pre-Imperial Gothic, discussing the nature of faith and the relationship between certainty and truth. At first it seemed harmless enough, even banal, the kind of abstract theological speculation that scholars might engage in during their leisure hours. But as I read, following the author's logic through careful chains of reasoning, I began to feel something shifting in my understanding, a subtle destabilization of concepts I'd always taken as absolute. The book suggested, never explicitly but through implication and careful argumentation, that belief without evidence was not faith but merely hope, and that hope unexamined was indistinguishable from delusion. It proposed that the Emperor, beloved by all, mighty beyond measure, would surely prefer his subjects to love him through understanding rather than through blind obedience. It questioned whether worship performed out of fear could truly be called worship at all, or whether it was simply another form of coercion, a spiritual tyranny dressed in the robes of devotion. My hands began to shake as I read these passages, my voice faltering over words that suddenly seemed to carry a weight they hadn't possessed moments before. The proctor watched me intently, making notes, and I realized with creeping horror that this was the test itself, that every moment of my uncertainty was being catalogued, measured, weighed against some invisible standard I couldn't hope to comprehend. I made it through 30 pages before I had to stop, my throat closing around words that felt like razor blades, my vision swimming with tears I couldn't explain. The proctor nodded, satisfied, and made a final notation before dismissing me back to my cell. That night I prayed until my voice was raw, reciting every canticle I could remember, trying to drown out the questions that had taken root in my mind like thorns. Did I believe because I had been taught to believe, or because the truth of the Emperor's divinity was self-evident? And if I couldn't distinguish between the two, what did that say about the foundation of my faith? I slept poorly, troubled by dreams of vast, empty spaces and the sound of my own voice asking questions I couldn't answer. When the servitors came the next morning with my nutrient paste, I ate it mechanically, barely tasting the familiar copper tang, my thoughts still circling the doubts that had been so carefully introduced into my consciousness. This was my purpose now, I understood, to be a vessel for uncertainty, a living repository of all the questions that threatened the Imperium's spiritual stability. And if I broke under the weight of them, if I lost myself entirely to the corruption I was meant to test, then at least my destruction would serve as a warning to others, a data point in the vast calculations of the Ecclesiarchy's eternal vigilance. The tests grew more frequent, more intense. They exposed me to fragments of Xenotech that whispered in languages I shouldn't have been able to understand, showed me picked captures of distant worlds, where the Imperial creed had taken forms so divergent from orthodoxy that they resembled entirely different religions. I was made to listen to recordings of heretical sermons, to study the confessions of condemned psychers, to examine archaeological evidence that suggested disturbing conclusions about the history of the Imperium's founding. Each exposure was carefully controlled, measured in minutes or seconds, never long enough to cause permanent corruption, but always sufficient to leave its mark. Another layer of doubt and confusion added to the accumulating weight in my mind. Between tests they would run me through the confessor again, the neural induction machine attempting to reinforce my conditioning, to shore up the weakening walls of my faith against the tide of subversion I was required to endure. I began to lose track of which thoughts were truly mine and which had been implanted, which beliefs I held because I had chosen them, and which had been programmed into my neural pathways by the relentless cycling of doctrine through my brain. I would wake sometimes in the middle of the night, uncertain whether I had been sleeping or praying, whether the voice I heard reciting the litany of devotion was my own, or an echo from the machines that had been inside my head. The other faith testers began to vanish, taken away during the night by servo skulls, whose mechanical voices announced their dispositions with bureaucratic precision. Failed, corruption detected, scheduled for termination. Failed, faith insufficient, remanded for servitor conversion. Failed, psychological collapse, assigned to penitent engine duty. I listened to these pronouncements with a growing sense of inevitability, knowing that my own designation would come eventually, that the tests would continue until I broke or until they had extracted every useful data point from my deteriorating faith. Some small part of me, the part that still remembered who I had been before all this, wanted to rage against it, to refuse participation, to demand some accounting of why questioning a minor liturgical detail had led me to this cathedral of systematic spiritual destruction. But that part grew quieter with each passing week, smothered beneath the weight of conditioning and exposure, and the simple exhaustion of trying to maintain any sense of self in an environment designed to reduce me to a biological instrument. I prayed because I was supposed to pray. I ate because eating was required. I attended the tests because there was no alternative, and if somewhere in all of that mechanical compliance there still existed anything that could be called belief or devotion or love for the Emperor, I could no longer distinguish it from mere habit and fear. They brought me to the chamber of advanced scrutiny after 6 months of preliminary testing, informing me with the same bureaucratic detachment they brought to every interaction that I had demonstrated sufficient resilience to be useful for more significant exposures. The chamber was smaller than I expected, almost intimate, its walls lined with containment fields that shimmered like heat haze and smelled of ozone and something organic that might have been decay. In the center of the room stood a lectern of age-darkened wood, and upon it rested a tome bound in what I desperately hoped was synthetic leather, but suspected was not. The proctor for this session was different, an elderly priest whose augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as they focused on me, whose voice carried the rasping quality of someone who had screamed themselves hoarse long ago and never quite recovered. He explained that the book before me was a genuine artifact of heresy, recovered from a cult that had been purged 3 decades previous on a hive world whose name had been struck from all records. It contained theological arguments of such insidious sophistication that merely reading them had corrupted 12 previous faith testers, and I was to attempt to parse its contents while maintaining sufficient doctrinal integrity to provide coherent feedback on the nature of its deviations from orthodoxy. If I succeeded, my value to the program would increase significantly. If I failed, well, the disposal servitors were already on standby. The book's title, inscribed in gilt letters that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, translated roughly as "The Emperor's True Face," and from the moment I opened it, I felt something wrong emanating from the pages, a psychic resonance that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The text began innocuously enough, with familiar hymns and prayers, but gradually introduced variations, subtle changes to traditional liturgies that altered their meaning in ways I struggled to articulate. It proposed that the emperor had not simply been a man who became a god, but that he had always been something other, something that wore humanity like a costume, something whose divinity was of such alien nature that human minds could only comprehend it through the lens of religious metaphor. It suggested that what the Imperium worshipped was not the emperor himself, but a reflection, a shadow cast by something too vast and terrible to perceive directly, and that this distinction mattered, that the implications were profound and troubling and fundamental to understanding the relationship between humanity and its supposed protector. I read these passages aloud, my voice steady despite the growing pressure behind my eyes, despite the way the words seemed to writhe on the page like living things attempting to burrow into my consciousness. The conditioning held, barely, a thread of doctrinal certainty that I clung to, even as everything else seemed to dissolve into uncertainty and horror. I made it through 3 chapters before the priest called a halt, apparently satisfied with whatever data my suffering had provided, and I was returned to my cell with my mind feeling scraped raw, as if someone had taken steel wool to the inside of my skull. That night I couldn't pray, couldn't force the familiar words past my lips, and instead I sat in silence staring at the small shrine to the emperor, wondering if I was looking at the face of my god or at a mask, concealing something I lacked the capacity to comprehend. The distinction seemed important, felt like it should be important, but I couldn't grasp why, couldn't hold the thought long enough to examine it properly before it slipped away into the general fog of confusion and exhaustion that had become my baseline state of consciousness. Sleep, when it came, was haunted by images of vast golden figures, and the sensation of being watched by eyes that existed in too many dimensions, and I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth, and no memory of having bitten my tongue, but evidence enough in the bloodstain on my thin pillow. The pattern continued, an endless cycle of exposure and conditioning, each test pushing me closer to whatever invisible line separated useful instrument from corrupted waste. They showed me algebraic proofs that appeared to demonstrate the non-existence of the divine, played me recordings of alien songs that induced states of religious ecstasy, indistinguishable from those produced by proper imperial hymns, made me study comparative theology texts that suggested disturbing parallels between the imperial creed and the belief systems of species the Imperium had righteously exterminated. After each exposure, I would be processed through the confessor, its neural induction coils attempting to burn away the accumulated corruption, to restore me to some baseline of acceptable devotion, but I could feel it becoming less effective with each session, the conditioning beginning to fray at the edges like fabric worn too thin by repeated washing. My prayers became rote, mechanical, words recited without thought or feeling, because I had recited them 10,000 times before and would recite them 10,000 times more. The other faith testers I encountered during mandatory assembly grew stranger, more distant, as if they were slowly being replaced by hollow copies of themselves, shells going through the motions of humanity, while whatever had made them real gradually leaked away. I wondered if I looked the same to them, if they could see the emptiness spreading through me, the slow death of everything that had once made me a person rather than merely a biological machine for processing heresy. They began combining exposures, layering multiple forms of corruption to test for synergistic effects, to see how different heresies might reinforce each other in a subject's mind. I would read from a forbidden text while listening to Xenotech whispers, watch picked captures of divergent practices while inhaling vapors that supposedly contained trace amounts of warp taint, though I suspected that was merely psychological conditioning, another way to make me doubt the reliability of my own perceptions. The sessions grew longer, stretching from minutes to hours, my breaks between tests becoming shorter, the time allowed for recovery through prayer and conditioning insufficient to fully restore whatever it was that kept breaking with each new exposure. I lost weight, my body consuming itself, as my mind was consumed by the endless assault of doubt and subversion and carefully curated spiritual poison. The nutrient paste began to taste of nothing at all. Might as well have been eating ashes, and I consumed it only because the servo skulls would report non-compliance if I refused, and non-compliance meant immediate termination, and some stubborn remnant of self-preservation still flickered in the ruins of my consciousness. I clung to it, that animal desire to continue existing, even though I could no longer articulate why existence mattered, what purpose it served, beyond postponing the inevitable moment when I would be designated as failed and disposed of with the same bureaucratic efficiency that governed every aspect of this place. The breaking point came, as I suppose it had to, during a test involving what they called an immersive heretical experience, which meant they strapped me into a full sensory deprivation tank and fed me what amounted to a waking dream, a constructed reality so detailed and convincing that I forgot it wasn't real, forgot that somewhere outside this false existence there was a cathedral and a cell, and a life I had once lived. In the vision, I was a scholar on a peaceful world, one that had never known the Imperium's embrace, where humanity had developed without the crushing weight of the Imperial creed, without the eternal vigilance against chaos, without the endless grinding machinery of faith and war. People lived simple lives, found meaning in their work and their relationships, worshipped or didn't worship according to their own choices, and no one disappeared in the night for questioning doctrine, no one was burned alive for the crime of doubt. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly, profoundly heretical. This vision of what humanity might have been without the Emperor's guidance, and I lost myself in it completely, lived years in that false world, forgot that I had ever been anything else. When they pulled me from the tank, after 6 hours of real time, I couldn't immediately remember where I was, who I was, why the world around me was so much darker and colder and more oppressive than the one I had just left. The dislocation was absolute, devastating, and for the first time since arriving at the Cathedral of Perpetual Vigil, I broke down completely, sobbing not with fear or pain but with grief for a life I had never lived, a world that had never existed, a version of humanity that would never be permitted to take form because it represented everything the Imperium had been built to prevent. They designated me as compromised after that session, my conditioning deemed insufficient to continue with advanced exposures, and I was transferred to what they called the maintenance phase, which meant they would no longer test me with new heresies, but would instead study the long-term effects of accumulated exposure, would observe how the corruptions I had already internalized manifested over time without additional intervention. My cell remained the same, my schedule of prayers and minimal sustenance unchanged, but the confessor sessions ceased, and with them went the last pretense that I was being maintained as a useful instrument rather than simply kept alive for observational purposes. I was to be a living case study in the degradation of faith, a specimen for future faith testers to learn from, an example of what happened when a soul was exposed to too much doubt without sufficient spiritual reinforcement. The other faith testers in the maintenance phase were hardly people anymore, most of them lost to catatonia or religious mania, gibbering in their cells about visions of the emperor's true face, or the illusory nature of the material realm, or alien gods, that promised salvation from the endless suffering of the Imperium's existence. I listened to them at night, their voices filtering through the stone walls like the whispers of the damned, and I wondered if I sounded like that, if I had already crossed some invisible threshold into madness without noticing, if the voice in my head that still tried to maintain some coherent sense of self was merely a final delusion, a ghost haunting the ruins of my sanity. Time became meaningless in the maintenance phase, days bleeding into weeks, bleeding into months without any external markers to distinguish one moment from another. I prayed when I remembered to pray, which was less and less often, the words feeling increasingly hollow, stripped of whatever power they had once held. The small shrine in my cell seemed to mock me, the emperor's face looking down with what might have been compassion or might have been contempt. I could no longer tell the difference. Sometimes I would stare at it for hours, trying to recapture whatever feeling of devotion I had possessed before all this, before they had systematically filled my head with every argument against belief, every doubt, every alternative interpretation that undermined the foundations of faith. But it was like trying to remember a color I had only seen once as a child, impossibly distant, more concept than memory, and eventually I would give up, would lie on my thin mattress and stare at the ceiling and wait for nothing in particular. The servitors still brought me nutrient paste twice daily, still monitored my vital signs, still recorded my mandatory prayer sessions, even though I often forgot to perform them, and I supposed that somewhere in the vast administrative apparatus of the cathedral, someone was compiling reports on my condition, tracking the progression of my spiritual dissolution for the benefit of future operations. I was data now, nothing more, a collection of observations about the limits of human faith when subjected to systematic corruption. And if that data required me to continue existing in this state for years or decades, then I would continue, because I had no will left to do otherwise. The visitors started coming after what might have been a year in maintenance, though I had no reliable way to measure time anymore. They were priests and inquisitors, and occasionally tech priests, always accompanied by proctors who explained in clinical terms the nature of my exposure history and current psychological state. They would stand outside my cell and observe me like I was an animal in a menagerie, asking questions about which heresies I'd been tested with, what warning signs I'd displayed before my conditioning failed, what protocols might have prevented my deterioration. I answered when addressed directly, surprised to discover that I could still speak coherently when required, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too flat, too empty of affect. Sometimes they would ask me to demonstrate my exposure to specific corruptions, would request that I recite passages from heretical texts, or describe the theological arguments I'd been subjected to, and I would comply, pulling the memories from somewhere deep in my mind where they had been carefully stored and catalogued by all those months of testing. The words would flow out of me like water from a cracked vessel, and I would see the visitors exchanging glances, making notes, nodding with what might have been understanding or might have been satisfaction at having their hypotheses confirmed. After they left, I would always feel somehow emptier, as if reciting those heresies had cost me something I hadn't known I still possessed, another small piece of whatever remained of my original self, sacrificed to the cathedral's insatiable need for information. I began to forget details of my life before the cathedral. Couldn't remember my mother's face clearly anymore. Wasn't certain whether I'd had siblings or lived alone. Could no longer recall the specific layout of my hab block or the name of the street I'd walked every day to my labor assignment. These things slipped away like water through cupped hands, and I didn't particularly mind their loss. They belonged to someone else anyway, to that naive fool who had questioned a presbyter's ruling and thought it would be a minor matter, easily resolved. That person was dead, had died slowly over the months of conditioning and testing and systematic spiritual destruction, and I was merely what remained, a hollow thing wearing their skin, continuing to breathe and eat and exist because those were the functions I had been designed to perform. The proto-me would have been horrified by what I'd become, would have fought against it, would have preferred death to this empty persistence, but they had never understood that death was a mercy the Imperium rarely granted, that there were so many worse fates than simple termination, that serving even in destruction was the highest calling a citizen could aspire to. I understood that now, understood it with a clarity that might have been enlightenment or might have been the final collapse of whatever capacity for self-deception had previously protected me from the full implications of my situation. The dreams, when they came, were always of the false world I'd experienced in the immersive test. That vision of humanity without the Imperium's crushing weight, and I would wake with tears on my face and no memory of having cried, would lie in the darkness, trying to recapture even a fragment of what it had felt like to exist in that gentler reality. But the details faded quickly, leaving only an ache, a sense of profound loss for something I'd never truly had, and I would force myself through the motions of prayer to drive the feeling away, would recite litanies I no longer believed in, because the alternative was to acknowledge the full weight of what had been done to me, what I had been made to do to myself. The Emperor's face on my shrine seemed to shift sometimes, the chipped ceramite appearing to display expressions it couldn't physically produce, and I wondered if I was hallucinating, if the accumulated spiritual poison had finally begun to produce perceptual distortions, or if there was genuinely something looking back at me through those empty eyes, something that might have been divine, or might have been my own fractured consciousness, projected outward in a desperate attempt to find meaning in meaninglessness. They came for me on what I estimated was a day like any other, though my sense of time had degraded to the point where days and weeks were barely distinguishable. The proctor who delivered the news spoke without emotion, explaining that my observational period was complete, that I had provided sufficient data on the long-term effects of accumulated heretical exposure, and that I was now to be transferred to my final assignment. I asked what that assignment was, more from habit than curiosity, and he consulted his data slate before responding with the same bureaucratic detachment he brought to everything. Servitor conversion. Specifically, I was to be made into a prayer servitor, my remaining biological functions preserved solely to enable continuous recitation of liturgies, my mind wiped of everything except the words I would spend eternity repeating. It seemed fitting, in its way, a final irony that I, who had lost my faith through too much exposure to doubt, would spend whatever remained of my existence mechanically producing the expressions of belief I could no longer genuinely feel. I nodded acceptance, because what else was there to do? Because I had known since my first day in this place that this, or something like it, was my inevitable destination, because I was too tired and too empty to feel anything resembling horror at the prospect of my continued existence as a lobotomized shell, chanting prayers to a god I could no longer quite remember how to worship. The conversion facility was deeper in the cathedral than I'd ever been taken before, down corridors that felt like descent into the bowels of some vast organism, the walls organic-looking in their curves and textures, the air growing warmer and more humid with each level we descended. I could hear machinery everywhere, the grinding and humming and clicking of countless mechanisms performing functions I couldn't begin to guess at, could smell industrial lubricants and something organic, and the ever-present incense that seemed to permeate every space in this entire cursed structure. The tech priests who would perform my conversion barely acknowledged my arrival. Focused on their preparations, the arrays of surgical implements and neural interface equipment and the throne-like apparatus I would be installed into once they'd made the necessary modifications to my body and brain. I was stripped, cleaned, marked with sacred oils and ritual diagrams, the whole process feeling distant and unreal, as if it were happening to someone else while I watched from far away. They explained the procedure in technical terms I didn't fully comprehend, something about cortical bypass and motor function isolation and the installation of perpetual vox units that would enable continuous prayer output, and I listened with the same empty attention I'd brought to everything for months now, understanding that none of it really mattered, that the person who might have cared about such details had died long before reaching this room. The moment before they activated the conversion protocols, there was a strange clarity, a brief window where all the fog and confusion lifted, and I could see my situation with absolute precision. I was about to be destroyed, not in the sense of simple death, but in a much more profound way, unmade and remade into something that would parrot the words of faith, while containing no actual belief, would serve as a monument to the Imperium's cruelty and efficiency and absolute indifference to individual suffering. I had been brought to this point through no real fault of my own, a minor question leading to months of systematic torture disguised as testing, my mind deliberately filled with poison, and then my failure to resist that poison used as justification for this final atrocity. And yet, even understanding all this, even seeing clearly for the first time in months the full scope of what had been done to me, I felt nothing, no rage, no grief, no resistance, just a kind of weary acceptance. This was the Imperium. This was how it functioned, how it maintained its grip on humanity's collective throat through 10,000 casual brutalities and 1,000,000 small destructions, through the grinding machinery that processed souls as efficiently as it processed promethium or munitions, or any other resource required for eternal war. I was merely one more component in that machine, and my personal suffering was so utterly insignificant in the face of that vast, inhuman apparatus that to rage against it would be like screaming at the void and expecting an answer. The drugs they gave me before beginning the procedure induced a state that was neither sleep nor waking, consciousness without coherence, and I drifted through it, watching my own body from impossible angles as they worked, opening my skull, attaching interfaces directly to my brain, removing portions of my frontal cortex that they deemed unnecessary for my new function. I felt no pain. The anesthetics were too effective for that, but I experienced a kind of existential agony, a sense of myself being dismantled piece by piece, memories and personality, and everything that had made me an individual peeled away like layers of dead skin to expose the raw functionality beneath. They were efficient, the tech priests, their movements precise and practiced, and I understood that I was merely one of hundreds or thousands of conversions they had performed, that my transformation was routine, unremarkable, another routine maintenance task in the endless operation of the cathedral's systems. The Vox units they installed felt like weights in my chest, foreign objects that my body immediately began trying to reject, and I could hear the tech priests discussing the need for additional immunosuppressants, for deeper integration of the augmetics, their voices flat and clinical, as they reshaped what remained of my humanity into something more useful, more reliable, more completely subservient to the Emperor's supposed will. When they activated the prayer protocols, I felt my mouth moving without conscious input, heard my voice speaking words I hadn't chosen to speak, couldn't have stopped speaking if I'd wanted to, which I didn't, couldn't. The distinction between wanting and not wanting having been surgically removed along with whatever portions of my brain had been responsible for generating such states. The prayers flowed in endless streams, liturgies and canticles and fragments of doctrine, all perfectly rendered, my augmented vocal cords capable of sustaining the output indefinitely without fatigue. Some small core of awareness remained, trapped inside the shell they'd made of me, watching with detached horror as my body performed its new function, but even that awareness was fading, being gradually overwritten by the perpetual cycling of prayers through what remained of my mind. I tried to hold on to something, some memory or feeling or fragment of identity that might serve as an anchor, might preserve some remnant of the person I'd been. But there was nothing to hold on to. They'd taken it all, carved away everything except the capacity to speak, the Emperor's praises, and the minimal biological functions required to sustain that capacity. I felt myself disappearing into the words, becoming nothing but a vessel for their transmission. And distantly, from very far away, I experienced something that might have been relief, might have been surrender. The cessation of the struggle to remain human in a system that had never valued humanity except as a resource to be extracted and deployed in service of its own continuation. The last coherent thought I had, before the prayers consumed what remained of my consciousness entirely, was a kind of bitter gratitude that at least I wouldn't remember, wouldn't have to carry the weight of knowing what had been done to me, would exist in the eternal present of liturgical recitation without past or future, or any of the suffering that came from being aware of one's own destruction. They installed me in the cathedral's main chapel, I think, though my sensory input was so limited now that I couldn't be certain, could only perceive the echo of my own voice reflected back from stone walls, and the dim awareness of other prayer servitors stationed nearby, all of us chanting in perfect synchronization, our voices blending into a single endless hymn of devotion to a God whose existence I could no longer quite recall the reasons for doubting or believing in. The words flowed through me like water through a pipe, meaningful only in their passage, and I was no longer there to question them, to wonder whether they expressed any genuine truth or merely served to reinforce the systems of control that had brought me to this state. I had become what the Imperium needed me to be, a pure instrument of faith, empty of doubt because I was empty of everything. And if that was a kind of victory for the forces that had shaped me, that had taken a young man's minor question and transformed it through months of careful torture into this final apotheosis of meaningless devotion, then I was too far gone to resent it, too thoroughly destroyed to care about anything beyond the next word, the next prayer, the endless mechanical expression of belief in a future I would never see. Serving an emperor I no longer possessed the capacity to love or hate or understand, merely another component in the vast machine, grinding forward through eternity, holy and terrible and absolutely indifferent to the countless lives it consumed in its operation. And I prayed and prayed and prayed, and would pray until my biological components finally failed, and I was replaced by another faith tester, whose doubt had been refined into this same perfect, hollow devotion, the cycle continuing forever, without end, without meaning, without anything but the words themselves, echoing through the cathedral's vaulted halls, the sound of humanity's soul slowly dying in the service of its own survival. And I couldn't stop, couldn't pause, couldn't do anything but continue speaking the liturgies that had been burned into what remained of my brain, a monument to the Imperium's casual brutality, its infinite capacity for turning suffering into service, doubt into devotion, people into instruments, and somewhere very far away, in a place I could no longer reach, The person I had been was screaming, but no one could hear them. Not the priests who walked past my station without a second glance. Not the faithful who came to worship and found comfort in the endless prayers echoing through the sacred space. Not even myself, because I was no longer there to hear anything. Just gone, erased, replaced by this thing that wore my body, and spoke with my voice but contained nothing of what had made me human. And the tragedy of it, the final terrible irony, was that this was considered a mercy, a better fate than simple execution, a way to serve the Emperor even in failure, to be useful even in destruction, and I would have laughed if I'd still possessed the capacity for laughter, would have raged if rage had been available to me, but all I could do was pray, the words spilling out in perfect cadence, flawless articulation, empty of everything except their own mechanical persistence. A prayer that would continue until the cathedral itself crumbled to dust, until the Imperium fell, and humanity's long suffering finally ended, until the Emperor's golden throne failed, and the galaxy was consumed by the very darkness it had fought so long to hold at bay, and still the words would continue, would echo through the ruins of civilization, because that was what I was now, what they had made me, a prayer that had forgotten how to stop, a devotion that required no faith, a faith tester whose testing had revealed only that faith itself was just another resource to be extracted, refined, and deployed in the service of systems too vast and too terrible for any individual consciousness to comprehend or resist. And I prayed, and prayed, and prayed, forever and ever. Amen.